She did not scream when she found out. She did not cry in the way people expect someone to cry when everything they believed about their life turns out to be a carefully constructed performance designed specifically for their destruction. She sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in Memphis, Tennessee, with a cup of coffee she had not touched, and she looked at the wall, and she was quiet for a very long time, and in that quiet something that had been slowly dying inside her for 11 years finally stopped fighting and let go. Not because she had given up, but because she had finally, after 11 years of being told she was wrong about everything, been told by someone with the authority to say it officially and on the record that she had been right about all of it, every single thing. From the very beginning, she had been right. And the people who loved her most had spent 11 years looking her in the eye and telling her she was not. And the man who had done that to her, the man who had stood in churches and school auditoriums and community centers and received standing ovations from people who trusted him with their children and their stories and their private fears. That man had spent 11 years making sure that when she finally spoke, nobody would believe a word she said. He had been so thorough, so patient, so impossibly careful, that by the time she tried to tell her own story, the people closest to her had already been given a different version of her, a version he had written, and they believed his version because he had made sure they received it first, every single time, without exception, for 11 years. And then one Tuesday morning in a Memphis courtroom, a judge asked him one question, just one, and 11 years of the most sophisticated family betrayal I have ever researched for this channel came apart in 45 seconds. Stay with me, because this story is going to change the way you listen to the people you love. Before we go any further, we would love to know where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your location in the comments right now, whether you are in Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, London, Lagos, or anywhere else on this earth. We read every single comment, and we love knowing who is in this community with us. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come out regularly on this channel, and you do not want to find out about them 3 weeks late. Denise grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, the middle child of 5 in a household that her sister Cheryl describes as the loudest, most loving, most chaotic place she has ever known. Their mother, Gloria, was a registered nurse who worked double shifts at Vanderbilt Medical Center and still somehow managed to have a hot meal on the table most evenings. Their father, Raymond, drove long-haul trucks and was home on weekends, and when he was home, the whole house reorganized itself around his presence the way a solar system organizes itself around its sun. They were not wealthy. They were not struggling. They were the specific kind of American family that holds everything together with discipline and faith, and the unspoken agreement that you show up for each other no matter what, no matter the hour, no matter the cost. Denise was the organized one in that family, the one who kept the calendar and remembered the appointments and noticed when someone was not quite right before they had found the words to say it themselves. Her sisters called her the family radar. If something was off in the emotional atmosphere of that household, Denise felt it before anyone else and named it before anyone else was ready to hear it. That instinct, that specific and finely tuned ability to read what was underneath what was being presented, would become the most important thing about her, and it would be the first thing Marcus tried to take. Denise was not a woman who drifted through life waiting for things to happen to her. She had a master's degree in social work from Tennessee State University. She had spent her 20s working in some of the most difficult and underserved communities in Nashville before relocating to Memphis to take a senior position at a nonprofit called Community Bridge that worked with at-risk youth and their families. She was known in her field as someone with an unusual combination of analytical precision and genuine human warmth. Colleagues described her as the person you called when a case was complicated and nobody could figure out what was actually happening beneath the surface. She had a gift for seeing the real story underneath the presented story, and she had spent her entire professional life using that gift in service of people who needed someone to see them clearly. The fact that this gift would eventually be the thing that saved her, after years of being used against her, is one of the things about this story that I find most difficult to sit with quietly. She met Marcus Ellison in the spring of 2009 at a community fundraiser in Memphis. She was there representing Community Bridge. He was there as a keynote speaker, a high school principal who had built a reputation in Shelby County as someone who could walk into a failing school and turn it around through sheer force of relationship. He was 41 years old. He was tall, well-dressed, and possessed of the specific kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from genuine mastery of the room. He knew how to make everyone in his vicinity feel like the most important person present. He sought Denise out specifically after his speech. He told her later that he had noticed her before he even reached the podium. He said she was the only person in the room who was listening to him instead of performing listening at him. She told her sister Cheryl about him that same night. And Cheryl told me that Denise's voice on that phone call had a quality she had not heard in it for years. Something open, something that had decided to let itself be seen. Cheryl told me she remembered thinking that this man must be something genuinely different because Denise did not talk about people the way she talked about Marcus that night. Denise, who had always been careful, always been measured, always been the one who saw through the surface of things before anyone else did, sounded like someone who had decided for the first time in a long time to simply feel something without immediately examining it. Cheryl told me she thought that was beautiful. She told me later she wished she had paid more attention to what it meant that a woman with Denise's instincts had needed to turn them off in order to fall in love with this particular man. Their courtship lasted 14 months, and every person who witnessed it described it using the same word: intentional. Marcus was intentional about Denise in a way that felt rare and serious. He remembered every detail she shared with him. He followed up on things she had mentioned weeks earlier. He asked about her work with a genuine curiosity that made her feel that what she did and who she was were worthy of sustained attention. He met her family early and charmed them completely. Gloria, Denise's mother, told Cheryl after the third time she met Marcus that she had never seen a man pay attention to her daughter the way that man did. She meant it as the highest compliment she knew how to give. She did not yet understand that the attention was not devotion. It was reconnaissance. Raymond, Denise's father, told Marcus at the engagement dinner that he was handing him the most important thing he had. He said it looking Marcus directly in the eye the way men of Raymond's generation say the things they mean most seriously. Marcus held his gaze and told him he understood. He said it with the specific gravity of a man who knew exactly how to be what each person in the room needed him to be. They married in June of 2010. The wedding was held at a Baptist church in Nashville, where Gloria had been a member for 30 years. Cheryl was the maid of honor. Raymond walked Denise down the aisle and reportedly cried in the specific silent way of men who have decided crying is acceptable only if no sound is made. By every account from everyone present, it was a genuinely beautiful day. The photographs from that day showed two people who look exactly like what everyone believed they were, a brilliant, well-matched couple beginning something real, and for a while, for what Denise describes as approximately the first 3 months of the marriage, it was. The first sign that something was wrong was so small that Denise almost did not register it as a sign at all. She had told a close friend something in confidence, something personal about a professional difficulty she was navigating at Community Bridge, something she had deliberately chosen not to share with Marcus because she was still working through how she felt about it herself, and she wanted the space to think without the weight of his perspective on it before she had formed her own. 3 days after that conversation with her friend, Marcus mentioned the situation in passing during dinner. Casually, "The way you mentioned something your spouse told you earlier in the week." Denise stopped mid-sentence. She had not told him. She was certain she had not told him. She asked him how he knew, and he looked at her with gentle concern and told her she must have mentioned it and forgotten. He said it the way you say something to a person who has a history of forgetting things. Except Denise did not have a history of forgetting things. She was the family radar. She was the one who remembered everything. She sat with the discomfort of that moment for several days before she let it go, because the alternative, the thing the discomfort was pointing toward, seemed too large and too dark and too early in a marriage she had chosen with her whole self to look at directly. It would not be the last time that moment repeated itself. Over the following months, small things accumulated in the specific way that small things accumulate when someone is deliberately creating a pattern but spacing the incidents far enough apart that each one feels isolated rather than connected. Marcus would reference conversations Denise had not had with him. Marcus would mention things about her family that she had not shared. Marcus would occasionally, and with apparent concern, note that Denise seemed to be misremembering things, or overreacting to things, or reading situations in ways that did not match the observable reality. He never said these things cruelly. He said them with the specific warmth of a man who was worried about his wife. And because he said them with warmth, and because Denise loved him, and because each individual incident could plausibly be explained away, she did what people do when they are confronted with evidence that challenges something they have invested everything in believing. She explained it away herself. She told herself she was stressed. She told herself she was tired. She told herself that the transition from her independent professional life into a shared domestic life was simply an adjustment, and that adjustments produced friction, and friction produced moments of miscommunication, and that none of what she was noticing was anything more than the ordinary turbulence of two people learning to build a life together. This is the specific genius of what Marcus was doing, and I want you to understand it clearly because it is the engine that drives the entire story. He was not lying to Denise in the conventional sense. He was not telling her things that were obviously false. He was creating conditions in which the most reasonable explanation for what she was experiencing was herself. He was not building a cage around her. He was teaching her to build it around herself, and every time she explained away one of his incidents, she added another bar to that cage without knowing she was doing it. By 2012, 2 years into the marriage, the word paranoid had entered their vocabulary, not as an accusation, never as an accusation, not at first, as a gentle observation, as concern. Marcus would say in the specific, quiet voice of someone choosing their words carefully, so as not to cause hurt, that he sometimes worried about Denise's tendency to read threat into situations that did not contain any. He framed it always as love. He said it the way a loving husband says something difficult, because he has decided that honesty serves the person he loves better than comfortable silence. And because Denise was a social worker who understood the value of self-examination, and because she respected honesty, and because she was genuinely trying to be a good partner in this marriage, she took what he said seriously. She examined herself. She asked her friends if they had ever noticed this tendency in her. She sat with the question of whether her instincts, the very instincts that had defined her since childhood and powered her entire professional identity, might actually be a liability dressed as a skill. And this right here, is the cruelest thing Marcus Ellison ever did to Denise. Crueler than anything that came later, though much worse was coming. He took the thing she was most confident about, the thing that was most essentially her, the instinct that had kept her grounded and effective and real for her entire adult life, and he made her doubt it. He turned her compass against itself. And once a person's compass is pointing the wrong direction, everything they navigate toward will be wrong, and they will not understand why, and they will blame themselves, and they will try harder, and the trying harder will take them further from where they need to be. That is exactly what happened to Denise for the next 9 years, and the distance she traveled in the wrong direction because of a compass Marcus had deliberately miscalibrated is the real measure of what he took from her. In 2013, Marcus suggested that Denise begin seeing a therapist. He presented it as a gift, as his recognition that she carried a lot, that she worked in an emotionally demanding field, that she deserved a dedicated space to process her inner life without burdening their marriage with the weight of it. He even had a recommendation, a therapist named Dr. Carol Freeman, who worked in private practice in East Memphis and who Marcus knew professionally through the school district's mental health partnership program. Denise was initially hesitant, not because she was opposed to therapy. She had recommended therapy to dozens of her own clients over the years and believed in it genuinely. She was hesitant because something about the specific way Marcus framed the suggestion felt like it was solving a problem she had not agreed existed. But she could not articulate that hesitation clearly enough to justify refusing, and Marcus's concern seemed genuine, and the suggestion made logical sense for someone in her field, and so she went. She sat in Dr. Freeman's office for the first time in October of 2013 and began to tell her story, the story of her marriage, the small accumulating incidents, the conversations she apparently could not remember having. Dr. Freeman was warm, attentive, and skilled. She listened carefully. She asked good questions. She created the kind of space that good therapists create where a person feels genuinely safe to say difficult things. She was also, without knowing it, already operating from a framework that Marcus had helped construct, because Marcus knew Dr. Freeman professionally, because Marcus had on 2 separate occasions before Denise's first appointment expressed his concern about his wife's well-being to people in the school district's mental health network in ways that had eventually, through the specific indirect pathways of professional community gossip, and reached the ambient awareness of Dr. Freeman's professional environment, not as a briefing, not as anything that could be named or traced, just as the kind of quiet professional concern that shapes the atmosphere a clinician carries into a room before the first session begins. Denise would spend the next 3 years in that office twice a week. She would describe her experiences with precision and detail. She would lay out the pattern of incidents that troubled her. She would name what she was noticing. She would bring the specific observational skills of a trained social worker to the task of describing her own life, and she would do it clearly and consistently, and without exaggeration. And Dr. Freeman, with genuine care and clinical skill, would help her explore the ways in which her childhood experiences, her tendency toward hypervigilance developed in a loud, chaotic household, her professional immersion in trauma and dysfunction, might be shaping her perception of her marriage in ways that were not serving her or her husband. The therapy was not harmful because Dr. Freeman was negligent or incompetent. Dr. Freeman was neither of those things. The therapy reinforced Marcus's narrative because Dr. Freeman was working from incomplete information in an atmosphere that Marcus had subtly and deliberately pre-shaped. And this is the thing about what Marcus did that I find most worth naming clearly, because it is the thing that makes stories like this one so difficult to recognize and so impossible to interrupt from the outside. Coercive control of this sophistication does not require the cooperation of bad people. It requires only the unknowing cooperation of good people who have been given a story before they had a chance to look for one themselves. Dr. Freeman was a good person and a skilled clinician who was given a story before Denise arrived. Cheryl was a loving sister who was given a story before Denise called. Gloria was a devoted mother who was given a story before Denise came home. None of them chose to work against Denise. All of them did. Because Marcus made sure the story reached them first every single time, and the story he gave them was specifically designed to make everything Denise said sound like a symptom of the story rather than a contradiction of it. By 2015, Denise's professional life had begun to change in ways she could not fully explain. A supervisor who had previously championed her work and publicly credited her with some of Community Bridge's most significant program outcomes began expressing concerns about her reliability. A promotion she had been told was essentially hers did not materialize, and when she asked about it, the explanation she received was careful and kind and completely empty of any specific reason. A colleague she had considered one of her closest friends at work began maintaining a careful professional distance. Denise raised these things with Marcus, and Marcus listened carefully and expressed concern and suggested gently that some of what she was experiencing might be related to the difficulties that she and Dr. Freeman had been working through together. What she did not know, what she would not know for another 2 years, is that Marcus had spoken to her supervisor, not formally, not in any way that left a record, a conversation after a Memphis education community event, a quiet expression of private spousal concern about the pressure Denise was under and whether the organization was perhaps placing more on her than she could currently manage. The kind of conversation that plants something in the mind of a listener that grows without the listener ever understanding where it came from or recognizing that it was planted deliberately. In 2016, Denise took a leave of absence from Community Bridge. Marcus had suggested it. Her therapist had supported it. Her mother had exhaled with relief when she heard about it, because she had been quietly worried about Denise for some time. The leave lasted 8 months. During those 8 months, Denise was almost entirely at home, almost entirely dependent on Marcus financially, and almost entirely surrounded by a version of reality that Marcus controlled. She lost her professional network. She lost her daily reason to exist outside the marriage. She lost the one arena in her life in which she had a standing and a reputation that Marcus had not curated. When she returned to Community Bridge in early 2017, she was diminished in ways that were visible to the people around her, even if they could not locate the source of the diminishment. The woman who had been described by colleagues as sharp and grounded and unusually perceptive came back quieter, more hesitant, more careful about what she said, and more careful about who she said it to. People attributed this change to whatever personal difficulties had necessitated the leave. They attributed it to the narrative they had been receiving from the background of her life for years, which was that Denise Ellison had been struggling, and that her husband was doing everything possible to support her, and that the kindest thing the people around her could do was treat her gently and not add to what she was carrying. It was in the spring of 2017, approximately 7 years into the marriage, that something shifted inside Denise that she cannot locate in a single moment, but describes as a slow and quiet turning. She woke up one morning in the house on Beale Park Drive and lay in bed looking at the ceiling for a very long time before Marcus stirred beside her, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her with its sharpness and its completeness that one of two things was true. Either she was genuinely losing her mind in the way that everyone around her seemed to have quietly agreed she was, or someone was deliberately and systematically making her believe that she was. And she understood lying in that bed looking at that ceiling that she could no longer afford to not know which one it was. She got up before Marcus woke. She went to the kitchen and made coffee she did not drink. And then she went to her home office and took a legal pad from the bottom drawer of her desk, and she began to write. She wrote down every incident she could remember, going back as far as her memory would reach, which in Denise's case was very far, because Denise had always remembered everything. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. She wrote dates where she had them and approximate dates where she did not. She wrote names. She wrote what was said and what happened immediately after, and what changed in the days and weeks that followed each incident. She wrote the names of people who had said things to her that reflected Marcus's version of events back at her. When she stopped writing, she had 14 pages. She looked at those 14 pages for a very long time without moving. And then she went back to the first page, and she read the whole thing through from the beginning, as if this were someone else's story, and she were the professional being asked to assess it. And when she finished, she sat very still for a long time, because she knew exactly what she was looking at. She had seen this pattern before. She had helped other people name it, and document it, and survive it. She had just never in her life imagined that the person who would one day need her to do that work was herself. She did not call Marcus. She did not call Gloria or Cheryl or her therapist. She called a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, not yet, but a Memphis attorney named Rochelle Winters, who had spent 15 years working specifically on domestic cases involving coercive control, the kind of harm that leaves no physical evidence, the kind that does not fit the conventional template of what most people mean when they say the word abuse, the kind where the damage is real and total and documented only in the accumulated shape of what has been systematically removed from a person's life over time. Rochelle Winters had a reputation in Memphis legal circles as someone who was very difficult to fool and very difficult to discourage. She agreed to meet with Denise on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after Denise made the call. Denise brought her 14 pages. Rochelle read them at the table, while Denise sat across from her and watched her read. When she finished, she set the pages down on the desk, and she looked at Denise, and she said 4 words, "I believe every word." Denise told me later that she had not understood until that moment how completely and how thoroughly she had stopped expecting to be believed. She had not cried in Rochelle's office. She had thanked her and asked what came next with the composure of someone who had been holding themselves together for a very long time and was not going to stop now. But she had sat in her car in the parking garage beneath Rochelle's building for 45 minutes before she could make herself drive. And in those 45 minutes, sitting in a parking garage in Memphis, Tennessee, something that had been clenched inside Denise Ellison for approximately 6 years began slowly and carefully, and with enormous difficulty, to unclench. Rochelle told Denise that she needed to document everything going forward with the precision and consistency of someone building a legal case, because that is exactly what she was doing. Denise stopped at an office supply store on her way home and bought 5 new legal pads. She identified a hollowed-out medical reference book on the bottom shelf of her office filing cabinet at Community Bridge as the place she would keep them. She began that evening. Over the following weeks and months, and then years, she continued. She documented every incident with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent her career helping other people build records that would survive scrutiny, and who understood exactly what level of detail and specificity that required. By the time she filed for divorce in March of 2020, she had filled 9 legal pads. She had been documenting for 3 years. She had been waiting with the patience of someone who understood that a case built too quickly on insufficient evidence is worse than no case at all. That the moment to move is not when you are ready emotionally, but when what you have is enough. Before we go any further, we would love to know where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your location in the comments right now, and tell us what you think of this story so far. And if you are not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We are building something real on this channel, and we want you to be part of it. When Marcus Ellison was served divorce papers in March of 2020, he did what Marcus Ellison had always done when confronted with a situation he had not initiated and could not immediately control. He moved to manage it before it could develop a shape he had not approved. Within 48 hours of receiving those papers, he had contacted Gloria. He had contacted Cheryl and Denise's other sisters. He had contacted 3 members of Denise's extended family, and in every single one of those conversations calibrated with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 11 years and who understood exactly what each specific person needed to hear in order to receive what he was telling them. He delivered the same essential message with variations tuned to each audience. Denise was in crisis. He had seen this coming for a long time. He had done everything in his power to support her and to hold the marriage together. He said it with sorrow. He said it with the specific quality of reluctant honesty that belongs to someone who has been protecting a painful private truth for years and is now disclosing it only because the situation leaves no alternative. And people believed him. Of course they believed him, because they had been believing him for 11 years. Because he had spent 11 years ensuring that the version of Denise that lived in the minds of the people who loved her was a version that made this moment feel like confirmation rather than revelation. By the time Denise reached out to her family about the divorce, every person she contacted had already been reached. Gloria received her daughter's call with the careful gentleness of a mother who has decided her child is fragile and must be handled with love, but also with a certain protective caution. Cheryl listened to her sister with a quality of attention that Denise recognized immediately, and precisely because she was trained to recognize it. It was the attention of someone who is evaluating what they are hearing against a pre-existing framework rather than simply receiving it. Cheryl was not hearing Denise. Cheryl was measuring Denise's words against Marcus's version of events and looking for the places where they confirmed what he had already told her. Denise recognized this because she had seen it hundreds of times in her professional life. She knew exactly what it looked like when someone who loved you had been turned, without their knowledge or consent, into an instrument of the person who was hurting you. She did not argue with Cheryl. She did not attempt to dismantle Marcus's version in real time, because she understood that you cannot counter a story that has been installed over 11 years in a single phone call. She said she understood, and she said she loved her, and she hung up and called Rochelle Winters. They kept building the case. Marcus hired Gerald Hutchins, one of the most experienced and aggressive family law attorneys in Memphis. A man who had been practicing for 30 years, Gerald's strategy was clear from the first set of filings, and it was elegant in its simplicity. He was going to put Denise's mental health on trial. He filed a motion requesting Denise's complete therapy records. All 3 years of sessions with Dr. Freeman. Each of these moves was entirely legal. Each of them was precisely calibrated to construct before the court a picture of Denise Ellison as a woman with a well-documented history of perceptual difficulties, professional unreliability, and mental health challenges that had required years of clinical intervention on paper. Before a single word of testimony had been given or a single piece of counter-evidence had been presented, the picture Gerald was assembling was genuinely damaging. It was damaging because it was built from real documents. The only thing wrong with it was the framework inside which it had been generated, which was not a clinical framework at all, but a narrative framework that Marcus had spent years constructing before any of those documents existed. Marcus sat at the respondents' table in the early hearings with the quiet, settled confidence of a man who believed he had already won and was simply waiting for the formality of the result to confirm it. He had spent 11 years building a paper record that pointed to Denise's instability. He had the therapy records. He had the employment records. He had the leave of absence. He had 11 years of people who would testify to their genuine concern for Denise's well-being. What he did not have, what he did not know existed, were 9 legal pads in a hollowed-out medical reference book on the bottom shelf of a filing cabinet at Community Bridge. Rochelle had retained Dr. Sandra Hayes, a forensic psychologist based in Nashville, who had spent 22 years working specifically on coercive control cases for family courts across Tennessee. Dr. Hayes reviewed the 9 legal pads in their entirety. She reviewed the complete therapy records. She reviewed the full timeline of Denise's professional history at Community Bridge, including the leave of absence and the circumstances surrounding it. She reviewed the communications Marcus had sent to family members in the 48 hours following the divorce filing. several of which had been forwarded to Denise by family members who did not understand they were providing evidence when they did so. She worked for 6 weeks. She produced a report that was 53 pages long, and her conclusion was contained in a single sentence at the end of the executive summary. The pattern of behavior documented across these materials is consistent with a sustained and methodical pattern of coercive control exercised by the respondent against the petitioner throughout the duration of the marriage. Rochelle called Denise the morning the report arrived and read that sentence to her over the phone. Denise asked her to read it again. Rochelle read it again. Denise was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you," and she hung up, and she called Cheryl, and she read it to her. Cheryl was quiet for a long time, long enough that Denise asked if she was still there. And then Cheryl said, "I think I need to come to Memphis." She got in her car and drove from Nashville that same afternoon, and she held her sister for a long time when she arrived. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September of 2021 in Shelby County Family Court. The Honorable Judge Patricia Okafor presiding. Marcus arrived with Gerald Hutchins and 2 junior associates and a banker's box of documents, and the composure of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most competent person in every room. He entered. He wore a dark suit and a conservative tie, and he arranged his papers at the respondent's table with the calm, unhurried efficiency of someone who has decided that the performance of confidence is indistinguishable from confidence itself, and who has been right about that his entire life. Denise arrived with Rochelle Winters and a rolling document bag that contained, among other things, the 9 legal pads and Dr. Hayes' 53-page report. She wore a deep blue dress, and she sat down at the plaintiff's table without looking at Marcus. Cheryl was in the gallery 3 rows back, and she told me that from the moment Denise walked into that courtroom, something about her was different from anything Cheryl had seen in years. Not different in a dramatic way, not the difference of someone performing strength for an audience. The difference of someone who had arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognized the place and understood that this was where the journey had been going all along. Gerald Hutchins put Marcus on the stand first and walked him through his prepared testimony with the precision and assurance of a man who had rehearsed this exact sequence many times and knew exactly where each answer was supposed to land. Marcus spoke about his marriage with measured sorrow. He spoke about his love for Denise with warmth that sounded genuine, because on some level it may have been. He described years of watching his wife struggle with perceptions that did not match reality. Years of gentle attempts to help her see things more clearly. He described his decision to recommend Dr. Freeman as the most loving thing he knew to do for a woman who was suffering in ways she could not fully acknowledge to herself. He described the leave of absence as something he had encouraged and supported at real personal and professional cost, because he believed it was what Denise needed, even if she could not see it herself. He said all of it without a single false note. He said all of it with the specific coherence of someone who has told a story so many times that it has stopped feeling like a construction and has become simply the truth as he experiences it. Gerald finished his direct examination and sat down, and Marcus settled slightly in the witness stand with the particular quality of relaxation that belongs to someone who believes the difficult part is behind them. And then Rochelle Winters stood up. She did not move immediately. She stood at the plaintiff's table for a moment with her eyes on her notes, or appearing to have her eyes on her notes, and the pause was long enough that its length became a statement, long enough that everyone in that room felt it, long enough that Marcus looked at her once, and then looked away, and then looked back, and then she walked to the center of the courtroom floor, not to the podium, and not to the witness stand, but to the exact center of the room where she was equidistant from the judge and the witness and the gallery. And she looked at Marcus Ellison and she asked him one question. She said, "Mr. Ellison, you have testified at length today about your wife's difficulties with accurately perceiving reality during your marriage, and I want to ask you something very specific. In 11 years of marriage, 11 years, can you give this court one example, just one specific example, of an incident in which your wife believed something was happening that you can demonstrate was not actually happening? Not a pattern, not a general description of her tendencies, not a characterization of her mental state. One specific incident, one moment, one time that Denise believed something was true that you can show this court was demonstrably false." And the room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted, and everyone present can feel the shift before they understand what caused it. Marcus Ellison opened his mouth, and what came out was a generalization, a description of a recurring pattern, The kind of answer that had satisfied every audience he had ever addressed this question to. Because every audience he had ever addressed this question to had been satisfied by the general, and the atmospheric, and the characterization. Nobody had ever asked him for the specific. Nobody had ever sat across from him with a question this simple, and this surgical, and simply waited for an answer that matched what was actually being asked. Rochelle let him finish, and then said quietly, "Mr. Ellison, I asked for a specific incident. Can you give me one specific incident?" He tried again. Another articulate, well-constructed, non-specific answer that described everything about the experience of being married to Denise and demonstrated nothing about a single moment in which she had been wrong about something specific. Rochelle waited for him to finish again, and then said simply, "One specific incident, Mr. Ellison, just one." The third attempt began the same way, and it was at that point that Judge Patricia Okafor, who had been watching Marcus Ellison from the bench with the focused stillness of a woman who has spent 20 years listening to people perform their versions of events, leaned forward very slightly, and said in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely final, "Mr. Ellison, counsel has asked you for one specific example. Do you have one?" And Marcus Ellison, who had an answer for everything, who had been answering questions about his wife's instability for 11 years to family members and colleagues and church members and therapists and school boards, who had sat in that witness stand for 40 minutes and deployed the full force of his considerable intelligence and his extraordinary interpersonal skill, looked at the judge, and he looked at Rochelle, and he looked at the 9 legal pads sitting on the plaintiff's table, and for the first time since entering that courtroom, he looked at Denise, and Denise was looking directly at him, not with anger and not with triumph, but with something much quieter and much more complete than either of those things. With the recognition of a woman who had known exactly who he was for a very long time, and was watching the last room in the world that had not yet caught up to what she knew finally, slowly, and permanently arrive at the truth. He did not have an example. In 11 years of telling everyone who would listen that his wife could not accurately perceive reality, Marcus Ellison had never once been asked to produce a single specific instance of her being wrong about anything, because he had never needed to, because the story had always been enough, because every audience he had performed it for had received it without requiring it to be proven, until this room, until this judge, until this question, until now. Judge Patricia Okafor issued her ruling 3 weeks after the hearing, and it was 71 pages long. The section addressing the coercive control findings was 19 pages, and it was written with the kind of specificity and moral clarity that Rochelle Winters told me she had rarely encountered in a family court ruling. The judge found that the pattern of behavior documented in Dr. Hayes's forensic report and corroborated by the 9 legal pads, and the communications timeline, and the professional history, and critically by the respondent's own demonstrated inability in sworn testimony to produce a single specific counterexample, was consistent with a sustained and deliberate pattern of coercive control exercised by Marcus Ellison against Denise Ellison throughout the duration of their marriage. She addressed the therapy records specifically and at length. She wrote that the therapeutic documentation submitted by the respondent as evidence of his wife's mental health difficulties was more persuasively interpreted in context, not as clinical evidence of instability, but as evidence of the effectiveness of the respondent's methodology. She wrote that the consistency between the clinical record and the respondent's narrative was not in the court's assessment evidence of clinical truth, but evidence of deliberate and sustained construction. She wrote those words, deliberate and sustained construction, in the official public record of Shelby County Family Court, and they have been there ever since. She awarded Denise a financial settlement that included compensatory damages for 11 years of documented professional and economic disruption. She awarded Denise the family home on Beale Park Drive. Marcus Ellison resigned from Jefferson High School 4 months after the ruling. The school board did not ask him to leave. He chose to go, which tells you something about what he understood the public record now said about him in a community where his reputation had been the primary currency of his entire professional life. The name that was synonymous in Memphis with educational excellence and community leadership, and the specific kind of trustworthy masculine authority that entire institutions organize themselves around now exists in the public record of Shelby County Family Court attached to 19 pages of judicial findings about deliberate construction and sustained coercive control. That is the legacy he built in the city where he was celebrated. That is what remains when you strip away the performance. Denise returned to full-time social work in 2022, and she works now specifically with women in coercive control situations. Women who are where she was. Women who know something is wrong but cannot name it clearly enough to be believed. Women who have been so thoroughly managed that the people closest to them have already received a version of them that makes their voice sound like a symptom rather than a testimony. She told me that the most important thing she does in that work is something very simple. She listens without a pre-existing framework. She asks specific questions. And she makes an absolute practice of never allowing someone else's version of a person to reach her before that person has had the chance to speak for themselves. She told me that if one person had done that for her in 11 years, if one person in 11 years had refused to receive Marcus's version before hearing hers, things might have been different. Then she paused and said she was not sure that was true. She said maybe she needed the full weight of it. Maybe she needed all 11 years and all 9 legal pads and the specific depth of understanding that only comes from having survived something completely in order to be who she is now and to do what she does now. She said that was a complicated thing to sit with, and that she sat with it every day. And she said that she was still the family radar. She had just learned finally, and at enormous personal cost, the most important lesson of her professional life applied to herself, which is that the radar is only useful if you trust it. Cheryl drove from Nashville to Memphis the day Dr. Hayes's report arrived, and she has not gone more than 2 weeks without seeing her sister since that day. She told me that the conversation she had with Denise after the ruling was the most difficult conversation of her adult life. She sat across from her sister at the kitchen table on Beale Park Drive, and she told her she was sorry, and Denise said she knew, and then Denise said something to Cheryl that Cheryl told me she thinks about every single day without exception. Denise said, "Cheryl, you were not cruel to me. You were managed. And there is a difference between those two things that I need you to understand, because the women in your life who need you are going to need you to know that difference." Cheryl told me she did not deserve that grace. She said she had spent 11 years functioning as an instrument of the man who was dismantling her sister without ever knowing that is what she was doing, and that her sister, after the worst 11 years of her life, had looked at her across a table and offered her a framework for understanding her own role in what had happened that did not require her to be the villain. She said she had never been given a gift that large in her life, and she was going to spend whatever time she had left on this earth trying to be worthy of it. Here is what stays with me when I think about this story, and I have thought about it a great deal since I researched it. Marcus Ellison's most powerful weapon was not anything dramatic. It was not volatile or visible or the kind of thing that announces itself as danger. It was patience. It was the willingness to work slowly and carefully over years to make everyone in Denise's life fluent in a version of her that turned her voice into a symptom. He did not silence her by stopping her from speaking. He silenced her by making everyone she spoke to hear her words through a filter he had installed before she arrived. And the reason this is so difficult to defend against and so difficult to interrupt is that it requires nothing from the people it uses except their love for the person being harmed. Cheryl loved Denise genuinely. Gloria loved Denise genuinely. The friends and colleagues and church members and the therapist who was given a story before Denise arrived in her office, all of them operated from genuine care. And Marcus took that genuine care and turned it into a wall around his wife that was built entirely from the good intentions of the people who loved her most. That is what makes this story matter beyond the specific details of one marriage in Memphis, Tennessee. It is a story about what becomes possible when someone with enough intelligence and enough patience and enough interpersonal skill decides to use the love that surrounds a person as a tool for their isolation rather than their protection. And it is a story about what it takes to survive that, which is not heroism in the conventional sense. It is not a dramatic confrontation or a single moment of clarity or a rescue from outside. It is 9 legal pads and 3 years of patience and the specific, disciplined, unglamorous courage of a woman who decided that the truth of her own experience was worth the years it took to make it undeniable. Here is what I want to leave you with before you go. Rochelle Winters spent 3 weeks before that hearing deciding on the one question she was going to ask. She tested it against every possible answer Marcus might give, every deflection, every reframe, every smooth and reasonable explanation, and she arrived at that question because she understood something fundamental about the structure of what Marcus had built, which is that a story built entirely from atmosphere and characterization and General impression has no specific examples because it was never meant to be tested against specifics. It was meant to be received and believed and passed from person to person in the soft, convincing language of concern, and the one thing it cannot survive is someone who refuses to receive it and asks instead for one specific moment, one specific example, one specific time. Give me one example, just one. And he could not. And 11 years collapsed. So here is what I want to ask you before you go. Is there someone in your life right now whose story you have been receiving secondhand? Someone you have been hearing about through another person's version of them before you have heard directly from them? Someone whose voice you have been listening to through a filter someone else installed? I am asking because Cheryl was not a bad person and Gloria was not a bad person and Dr. Freeman was not a bad person. They were good people who were given a story, and sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is to refuse to be given a story about them before you have heard from them directly. Drop your answer in the comments and tell me what you think. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Hit the like button if this story hit differently, and subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are building a community here that tells the stories that matter, and we want you to be part of it. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.